attacking your customers in order to defend the plump diversity officers, that's an American take. And it's no surprise that anime is doing so much better because they don't have to deal with any of this nonsense. In fact, America used to know that the customer is always right. Now, obviously, the customer isn't always right, but it's a good principle to go by. It's the idea that you shouldn't attack the customer, you shouldn't go after the customer because it's bad business. But in modern day, this is what they do all the time on Twitter. And to no one's surprise, they end up fighting people, they end up downsizing. I'm not saying just like not attacking the customer would necessarily bring them better sales, but it definitely doesn't help. Okay, so here we have the idea that the argument that diversity, equity, and inclusion. I love the way that they are spinning it around now, because for all these years it was diversity, inclusion, equity, but then they realized it actually sounds kind of bad. You know, all of a sudden they care about PR when it's the holy die. But when it's PR with the customers, they don't care at all. So they're saying that it highlights the total misunderstanding of what being a good writer is. You don't somehow max out your stats and learn how to write every conceivable character, plot, or prose-wise. Here is the problem that I don't understand, okay? Maybe you can get your diversity study professor to lecture me. Of course, I would have to go into student debt because they demand tens of thousands of dollars for this knowledge. But why the fuck is a AAA company outsourcing writing, which is probably the cheapest thing out of everything? I mean, there's not even that many AAA games coming out recently. It's maybe like 10 or 20 a year? And if you have like the same consultants that write for all these companies, don't you think the stories are going to become boring and stale? Didn't you guys whine and bitch about, oh my god, the tropes in video games? We need more originality, more creativity. Again, even if they were like the most creative writers, there's so much you can milk a writer until they run out of original content. So that would be just the first issue. But to explain why they constantly have to do this, it's like, why aren't their writers capable of writing stuff? Well, it's because in the American academia, the university professors have created this grand arching conspiracy theory, which has to do with the genetics of a person, right? Like his genome, his pedigree, can only allow him to enjoy art that is made by the same genome and pedigree, right? So theoretically, the best type of fiction is that your brother or your father has wrote. Like the closer to your family biology, the better the fiction, right? No, unironically, like they believe that black people can only enjoy stories by black people. They call this representation. It is completely maddening. Again, it's so easy to debunk because if this was true, every time your father or your grandfather wrote something, it would have to be the best shit ever for you, right? It's kind of like farts, you know, your farts smell better, right? So basically, their ideology is so broken that the only way it exists is because it doesn't get challenged. Because on one hand, they imply that you can't write something that everybody enjoys because it's based on race, on gender. But then they talk about inclusivity and they say, well, you need to write something that everyone can enjoy. You need to appeal to the wider audience. So on one hand, they say, well, we need to cater to minorities with our writing. But on the other hand, if you believe that writing is based on race and gender, then by catering to minorities, you're not catering to the majority, because now the majority doesn't see itself represented, right? So how do they deal with this? Well, they need to get experts in writing, okay? Which, again, the concept is idiotic, since creativity doesn't really work that way. I mean, if you have a person that works in a factory and he produces widgets for his entire life, yeah, that person is going to be really good at that, because you get muscle memory. But like a writer, you can have a person that never wrote anything and his first thing can be a masterpiece. Like everyone can just be like, wow, this is really good. And on the other hand, you can have someone that writes all of the time and his pieces can still be shit, right? But what they're talking about is not an actual writer. Like they're talking about an expert, an ideological possessed individual, right? So like someone from the academia that allegedly knows what minorities like to read and what offends them and what doesn't. And they hyper focus on the minorities. Again, completely ignoring the majority and completely ignoring just writing something that's entertaining. They do these focus groups that they're like hyper focusing on like 10 or 20 people that are from Scat Francisco. And if they don't like it, then they will say, well, no one likes it, right? So if they have like 20 people that are offended by the female form, then they will say, okay, well, we're not going to use the word women in our game. We're going to use body type A, body type B. We're going to make sure that no woman has titties, right? And they're basing that, again, on a fringe group and also the ideology that they learned from university that has nothing to do with reality. And they also will say shit like representation matters. Now, the thing is, there is some truth to it, right? Like if you are a person that grew up in a rural area, regardless of race, simply by growing up in that environment, you are going to know certain things about rural life. You're going to know how the people behave. You're going to know how the customs are like. You're going to know the type of work required to be performed on a farm. Like, you have more knowledge simply because you live there. And a person that lives in a city may not have that knowledge, right? But again, that doesn't mean that you're going to write good books. Nor does it mean that accurately representing life on a farm is going to be an interesting read. A great example would be Akira Toriyama, right? Like, Akira Toriyama's works transcended his national barriers, transcended race and gender and everything, and they probably transcend time as well, because 100 years from now, people will still know about Dragon Ball. I guarantee you. It's kind of like knowing about Beethoven. It's going to become a classic. But the thing is, Toriyama doesn't know anything about judo or martial arts or how, probably doesn't know how to fight. But his lack of knowledge in these things doesn't mean that Dragon Ball isn't good. Now, if he was skilled in combat, if he knew how to fight, if he actually was a black belt jiu-jitsu master, would that make Dragon Ball better? The answer, surprisingly, is probably not. Because in Dragon Ball, it's all about high fantasy, it's all about over the top, it's coolness. If you were to bring reality into it, then you may actually take away from the story. So just having this hyper focus on realism and representation and like describing the world as accurate as possible doesn't make for a good story. I mean, look at Wakanda. What does Wakanda do? It's like, okay, so we're talking about this fictional place in Africa that doesn't exist, but it's like incredibly high technological, and it's got this monarchy that is focused on a blood right, like you actually need to beat up the guy that came before you if you want to take his throne. Like this is, like that system would not even function. It's we don't even know how the life of an average peasant looks like in Wakanda, right? But it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to. It's sold simply because it is fantasy and it looks cool. Like that Black Panther suit looks cool and people want to see it. This obsession, like everything has to make sense and everything has to fit in reality, and no, it doesn't.